And welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Frame. It has been a while since any of our team have recorded one of these, but I'm happy to say that we are now getting the ball rolling again. It's been a busy start to the year. I've hosted a private safari to the Selous and to Ruaha, and I'm excited to be hosting a number of safaris there next year, as well as a trip to the Congo, to Odzala and the Republic of Congo. And that's one of the images that I'm going to be working on with you all today. So lots has changed, a new website layout and new blog. And the Behind the Frame series is now easily findable, or searchable rather, on the New Look blog. So you can go to the right-hand column and simply click on the category Behind the Frame, and you'll find all of the past episodes there. So if you're watching this for the very first time, either on our YouTube channel or on the blog, you can now find all of the Behind the Frame episodes in one place. So let's get stuck into today's image. And obviously this is quite a special image. This was my first time seeing gorillas. This is a Western Lowland Gorilla, and this was on the third morning of our treks in the Republic of the Congo. And the interesting part about the gorillas that we trekked there is that there are three groups really that they focus on. Two of them are tracked on a daily basis by guests and tourists in the area, and the third group is actually used as a control. So there's a lot of research which goes on here, and one of the variables that they're looking at is what is the impact of tourism on the gorilla's behavior. So very interesting. We were fortunate enough to come across them in a fairly open area at the base of a fruiting tree, and so this Western Lowland Gorilla has actually got a piece of what is much larger fruit, almost like a soccer ball or football size fruit in its mouth. If we have a look at the specs, obviously shooting in these kind of environments presents quite a bit of a challenge. The first thing that you'll notice is it's very dark, low light, and you've got dark subjects, so it can be quite tricky. I chose to shoot this entire scene using full manual with auto ISO. So what that allowed me to do was dial in my aperture value, dial in my shutter speed, dial in my exposure compensation, and then allow the camera to run with the ISO. This was actually shot on the Canon EOS R, so this is off of a mirrorless camera in low light with a 300mm 2.8 lens attached. So the Canon EOS R system, it has a series of lenses which are specifically designed for the Canon EOS R, but it also has an adapter which allows you to use all of the L series lenses and other lenses with it. There's no glass in there, so there's no change in the image quality whatsoever. It's literally a spacer which takes your lens a little bit further away from the mirrorless sensor on the back of the camera. So this was taken, I dialed in a shutter speed of 320th of a second. Remember that is 1 over focal length using a 300mm lens. 3.5, so just a little bit up from the maximum aperture of f2.8, and ISO 1000 was what the camera chose here. Now the important part to have a look at is the -1 EV, so that's underexposing. What we found ourselves doing in this low light environment a lot of the time was underexposing to purchase shutter speed at lower ISOs. So if I hadn't underexposed here, sure, the ISO would have been a little bit higher in order to maintain that correct exposure and the brighter exposure in this. So essentially by underexposing, we're telling the camera to keep the scene darker, which then means it doesn't have to be as sensitive to light. And in these conditions, this was fairly good because ISO 1000 is probably one of the lower ISO ranges that we shot at. But you do have a tendency to be shooting at very high ISOs in order to get anything close to a decent shutter speed. So if we have a look here, if I open up the basic panel, just to give you an idea, had we not underexposed by one full stop in this instance, this is kind of what the camera would have wanted to give us. So whilst that may be a correctly exposed image overall, I tend to prefer darker, more moody images, and you can see that by underexposing, we've kind of protected some of the details in the highlights, which we're going to look at, and we're going to address some of those now. Overall, very happy with where we're at as a raw image. So let's not waste any more time and let's get right into it. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my crop tool, and I prefer to get rid of distracting elements as much as possible using a crop. So for example, these two sections over here, those little shoots of the Marantaceae leaves that have come through here, the Marantaceae plants rather, I'm going to remove those. I'm looking at this little highlight that's right down at the bottom here, taking that out. And I think from a composition point of view, I quite like that. The rule of thirds subject is just off off of that, but very much the focus is there, the eye contact, and then also the part of contrast here. So remember that your eye is drawn to the areas which are sharpest and have the greatest contrast. So we've got these bright whites from the inside of the fruit against the dark black hand and face. So there's contrast there, a little bit of catch lights in the eyes. I'm comfortable that that's kind of where we want to be from a composition point of view. I'm going to have a look at the histogram now, and you'll see that even though we've underexposed, we haven't lost any detail in those shadows, and we've protected the highlights quite nicely. So from a global adjustment side of things, I want to see what we can do once we start to pull down the highlights. So the highlight areas will be the brightest parts of the frame. So little things like this left-hand corner over here and the detail in the fruit. If you have a look here, if you'll just zoom in to 1:1, you'll see that there's a little bit of highlighted areas over there. We can address that, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So all I'm going to do really on this is there's actually very little. Let's just do a saturation, because remember, by their very nature, raw images all need to be saturated slightly. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast by lifting the lights, and in the darker areas just dropping that slightly, but very little that actually needs to be done here. Detail, we're going to sharpen out and mask. Remember, when we're masking, holding down the Alt key and sliding out, anything that is white is what's going to be sharpened. So I'm wanting to eliminate all of that background. You'll see that there's some little specks floating around in the top left and just to the right hand side of the gorilla there. Those are sweat bees, which are hanging around the gorilla's face looking for moisture. So I'm happy that that's where we're going to go, and I'm going to take up the sharpening amount a little bit here. Using this little localized dropper, I can now explore the areas, and if I switch off the panel over here, let's come back. You can see that's a before and after, and we put it back on. You can see that there's quite a bit more clarity and sharpness which has been added to that. So overall, a very clean, quick edit, which looks pretty good. Now I want to do a couple of other adjustments to this image just to really make it pop. The one thing is the radial filter, and this is something that the guests that joined me on this trip, we got together for a bit of a Lightroom session once we got back here to Johannesburg. The radial filter is an incredibly useful tool in this kind of environment because of the dappled light that you've got. You've got a lot of dark areas in the frame, and typically you're wanting to isolate your subject from the background, and you're wanting to preserve the detail in the subject, but areas outside of that you're really not too concerned about. And because we are shooting generally at higher ISOs, we've got a bit of noise to deal with as well. So what we're going to do, the radial filter, using O for overlay, we can decide to see where we're working. And what we're going to do is we're just going to open this up, and we're going to make it a little bit more of an oval shape rather than a true circle. And I'm just going to increase the feather. Remember here, if there's no feather, we leave a very hard edge. And if the more we increase this feather value here, the more the effect is kind of bled into the frame. So you can see it just starts to affect the edges of the gorilla here, but we're not affecting the parts that we really want to preserve detail in, which is the face and the hand. So switching off our O for overlay and zeroing the effect here, remembering we're working outside of the circle, anything that is red is where we're working. First thing that I want to do is pull down the highlights, because I don't want those to be pulling our eye away from our subject. Because we have a subject, our real focus here is more in the top left-hand frame, in this area here, we can't use a true vignette, which would work around the dead center of the frame. So I'm going to kind of recreate a vignette by using 1/3 of a stop here, so a value of 0.3 or so, just to darken everything outside of the frame. And then finally, I'm going to drop clarity a little bit outside of the frame, just to a value of 10, and then noise. Now this works the opposite way, so you would think that you go this way to reduce the noise, but if you slide up this way, you will see that it'll actually smooth out noise in these areas outside of the radial filter. So hold down the space bar, I'm going to zoom into this little section here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch off the radial filter. Watch closely into this area here. So you can see that there's a little bit of graininess and noise in there. We're at ISO 1000, which is, you know, not very high at all these days for cameras. But once I switch this back on, look at the quality of these pixels around here. Yes, they're a little bit darker, but you'll see by combining the clarity and the noise sliders around this radial filter, we've been able to just kind of smooth that out a little bit. And because of the area that we've selected with that radial filter, we're not working the face of our subject. Finally, a couple of other adjustments. The first thing that we want to do is work in on this area of the fruit to see what we can do to just kind of bring back a little bit of detail into these highlighted areas. So you'll see if I switch on the overlay that we're now working just in these areas where there's the brightest whites. And what we're going to try and do is a bit of a localized adjustment on those areas to drop the exposure and see what we can recover there. So I'm going to switch off the overlay. I'm going to bring down the highlights and drop the exposure. And can you see now that we've brought back detail into those little segments of the fruit that we've got there? I'm just going to switch off the brush quickly for you so you can get an idea. That's what it was like before, and that's what it's like now. Okay, so a very minor adjustment, but it really does make a big difference in the greater scheme of things. Finally, we really want to just make this face punch up a little bit. So I'm going to go up and add a new brush. I'm going to come over here to my subject, use a larger brush using the square brackets, just increasing that. And now, if we hit the overlay button, you can see the areas that I'm going to work on are this eyebrow ridge, the face, down along the nose and the nostrils. These are just such beautiful animals. I cannot tell you the kind of excitement that you get when viewing them. And I'm going to work onto the hands and this piece of fruit and just kind of gently work around there. You'll see I'm not too fussed about going outside of the lines. I'm using a flow value of about 30 here. So what that means is the more I brush over a particular area, the more of the effect that I'm building up onto that area. So you'll see I'll just kind of brush over there and onto this. And I think just on the edge of the face there. Right, so I'm just going to pull back and show you where we're working now. I'm going with just a brush here just to bleed the effect that we're going to leave here so we don't leave any hard lines. Now I'm going to switch the overlay off, double click the effect. What we want to apply here is a little bit of clarity, lift the exposure just a touch. So the idea here is that we're going to push and pull the viewer's eye a little bit. So I'm just going to lift that exposure there and see if we can lift out the shadows. Alright, so if I come down here now and show you the brush that we've done, you'll see, do you see how there's a definite switch in your eye which is initially drawn to the brightest part, which is actually these highlighted fruit segments, but as soon as we've brushed over the area, we've dialed that aspect down and we've dialed up the face and the eyes. So as a quick before and after, in fact there's one other thing I'm going to do here. I just want to brush, I'm going to add in a new brush, and I'm going to go with a very large brush here, and I just want to drop the blacks and the exposure just a little bit. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do here just to make our subject pop out even more. Just going to work around this area. If you have a look at the O for overlay, you'll see the effect in the area that I'm working. So essentially, I'm using dark areas to push our subject, to push the viewer's eye away from particular areas in the frame, and using the brighter areas to pull the viewer's eye towards the face and the hand. And that's really what we want to do. So quite a bit of adjustments really, but overall, so let's just have a look at how that's looking. Right, so let's switch off all of the brushes. So that's without the brushes, that's with the brushes. Can you see how the area around the face and the hand lifts whilst the area in the background drops off? Have a look again. So that's fairly neutral, that's without the brushes, and as soon as we apply those brushes, we just dial up the presence of our subject that little bit extra. And I think as a before and after, you'll see that we really haven't changed the content of the image that much. But what we have done is dialed up the presence of certain features and aspects within the frame that we want our viewer to look at, and dialed down others that are potentially pulling the viewer's eye away from what we're wanting them to look at. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this session, our quick before and after. Really no major adjustments there, but makes a big difference to the final image. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's edition. There's going to be new ones coming up. I'm heading off to Namibia tomorrow, but I've got a couple of guys in the office who are very keen to share their skills with you, and I'm very excited to be bringing back Behind the Frame over the next coming weeks. That's it from me. If you have any questions or would like to make any requests as usual, you can drop me a mail, andrew@wild-eye.co.za. Thanks.